Hello, friends. This is the Tell It Like It Is podcast, and I'm your host, Alexi Bailey. I have a very special guest today, Wendy Ludlum. Thank you.
Like the writer?
Yes.
Yes.
Wendy, you're awesome. And I'm sure we have a million things we can talk about. We won't have time to cover it all today. But we've had so many amazing conversations. I think I wanted you to start a little bit today with a little bit about your Jewish faith and what that was like.
Okay.
Growing up, and what does it mean?
So in Judaism, there's, Reform, conservative Orthodox, and then Hasidic, which is, right off the charts. But there's also Reform Judaism where it's very secular and cultural, and that's more my family.
Okay.
So and
what part of
the world
did they come from originally?
Yeah, so diaspora is so interesting because you really don't know the steps that have led your family to, let's say, Bialystok, Poland, which was this area, which there is a historian who calls it bloodlines. So it's between Germany and Russia.
Yeah.
And this
I was just reading that book.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, the land is constantly getting the boundaries changing because 1 minute it's under Russian rule, the next minute.
Yeah.
And so they're from.
I have to say that I'm very sympathetic to the Jewish plight and everything that Jews have been through, and the resiliency and just the way that Jews have stuck together.
Yeah, well, you have to, for several reasons. If you are more, you're more oriented towards history and looking at Jesus Christ as one of the many prophets, and not God, then a lot of the Christian world around you takes great offense, and so it's been hard to reconcile being able to be separate. And
do you feel any connection to Jesus?
Well, I think of him as being someone who I would have followed and been drawn to, and that we have similar values. So there's the difference between Christian doctrine and the church, organized religion, and the thinking of the prophet Jesus, who was really the two political powers that he threatened were the temple hierarchy and then the Roman Empire.
Right.
And from my perspective, the reason why the Jewish temple power, I don't know, there's certain names like the Levites, this and that, and there's certain groups within, I guess, the Jewish tribe that are particularly are head of the temple. But what I was going to say though is that I believe that Jesus had more of a Hellenistic worldview, influenced by that. So that's why his what he was doing and representing and speaking was more Judaism coming away from strictly the way the hierarchy dictated, and this other kind of more. I think he was an incredibly compassionate, giving. He's really more of a he'd be a social democrat, or a communist, or social,
So all of these things, right? All of these things, we're having a human experience here, and all of these religions, all of these ideas, communism, social democrat, all of these things, all of these words begin to make all of these things confusing. So a part of what the podcast is about is just having an individual talk about the way they understand these things, so that it can help others get clarity and just have others understand your clarity.
Okay.
And maybe can be helpful, right? I think for me, I want to see healing in the African diaspora peoples. And I think the Jews are a good role model for healing and holding on to your identity, survival, and taking, trauma and moving forward. And, obviously when people try to, after trauma, there's all these different mental states and all these level of confusion. To really hold on to something and come back together is really special. So I always admire that. And, I think that people get lost in words like communism and social democrats and these things. So I just try to have a platform so people can kind of hear each other talk about it and say like, hey, I use this word, they're using a different word, but we're talking about the same thing. So my goal is that people will move past these words and definitions and say, you want a better future, I want a better future. And people can argue these words back and forth, but the reality is we want the same thing. We want to help the poor. We don't want wars. We want people to thrive, and everyone can do well. So your family came from Poland.
Right. Although, it's, I think they consider it Russian as Russians. Eastern European Jews. As you said, this boundary doesn't really, it's not so significant, but.
Now, the Jews that I know, the friends that I have that are Jewish, they're very much, they very much identify with the traumas of not just the Holocaust, but Jews has been through a lot, not just the Holocaust. Do you identify with all of that? Or
Absolutely.
How do you identify?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts on what you just said. And I think the aspect of Judaism, my Jewish culture, that resonates deepest is called Tikkun Olam, which is, and it's this idea that we have a responsibility to make the world a better place. I mean, that's really what being human is about. It's not necessarily about when the time is now, not after you die.
Right.
This is the time to repair, and even when during the marriage ceremony, and when at the end when the couple breaks the glass, usually it's the man. My husband and I both had a glass to break, and but the idea is that now you've got these shards, the glass is broken, and as a couple, it's your job also to fill the cracks, make the world a better place. So it's very clear, the message, that it's a broken world that we enter. And there's also, I would say for me, one of the biggest influences in terms of my identity as a Jewish person is the music of Leonard Cohen.
Okay.
He's someone who's very deeply spiritual, and he was someone who he writes about even when, so Judaism was important and practice, but his nanny on Sundays, he would go with her to the church, and he found that also, that spirituality was appealing.
Right.
So, and in his music, he talks about, there's a crack, there's a crack in the world, and that's how the light comes through, which is interesting because it almost symbolizes kind of the two things I was saying, that, yes, the world is broken, and that's the world we come into, but it also gives us an opportunity maybe for light. Maybe that is, how we can see that it's broken,
Right.
and that the light's important to break through to.
So I think for me, I've always had these grandiose ideas about unity and commune and people coming together, and like, I don't know, I know it's idealistic but utopian kind of vibes, and it's really hard for people to navigate their views versus someone else's. And I think we've been told that you're wrong, I'm right, kind of thing. And if you're Jew and I'm a Christian, then you're wrong and I'm right. Or Buddhists don't get it.
Well, I mean, clearly though, if as a human being, the come into this world, and there's a lot of mystery, right? And the more we learn and the more knowledge we have, it doesn't take away the mystery. So I think if you're an agnostic, let's say, if you did, I know we're not, but it doesn't mean you're not going to have some spirituality perhaps and wonder, right? Because you don't know, right? And I think that so I lost my train of thought. You were saying about
religion,
yes,
spirituality.
Okay. So all of the religions give people an opportunity to be guided, to be better, they acknowledge human nature, the frailty, and the how easy it is it's like we have to be tamed. Human beings have to be tamed. And so I think that, for example, and I've taken some courses as an adult looking at Jewish texts, and it's interesting because there's stories that are very psychological, like, what is going on. And so it's kind of teaching you that, this is a human condition. And so I want you to know that learn from this lesson, learn this story. So it's symbolic, But I was going to say that each person it really doesn't matter what your religion is. If you are truly connected to the values, if you live them.
So I tend to believe similar to you, right? Do you believe in heaven?
No.
Are you sure? Like what part?
No part. I mean, as a kid, you think of like some, guy with a long white beard or something, but no, I think.
What happens when you die?
Well, only recently. Well, I was taught that it's the memory of people that they live on in your memory, people that you love, and that's how you think about it. And often naming a child, you take the name of someone departed, you take the first initial, and you use that to name. So I think that's part of that memory. But recently, when my father died, and I was with both parents in hospice, I learned a whole new level of the mystery around death, and that I had an experience where I had a vision.
Tell me, I want to hear it.
Oh, it was incredible.
So this shaped your view of the afterlife?
Well, I still don't believe in heaven and hell, but I do have I feel a deeper connection to the energy is constant, right? And that it doesn't, that's kind of what exists. You could call it soul, but it's the piece that when the body is gone.
Right.
So
where is that?
Where does it exist?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if for me, so this vision was, I saw this sort of interwoven. It was at nighttime. I thought, woken up and I looked, and there was this it almost, if you think about when someone takes a knitting ball and they have their hands up and they're wrapping. So that was, kind of that image of strands that were had form, like an exterior form, but it wasn't. But it was a volume. There was volume to it, and most of the threads, they were black, and most of them were kind of thin. And there was one that was thicker, and it was black, but it had some red in it. And I mean, the lines were not linear. They had sort of not a wave, but they had almost some texture, some.
So you pictured hands. Was it your hands?
No, I was using that as a metaphor, actually, to give you an image of that. This
so
thing had form.
You pictured this giant knitted ball with.
No, it wasn't a ball. I'm sorry.
Something interwoven.
So it was the shape, like of when I was saying that if someone's knitting and they have their hands like this to wrap.
Got it.
So it had that.
Right.
And like the string of when you're doing that, there was this open volume, but it was what gave it form were these bands, these lines, these thin black, and
the infinite.
Well, then you had little flicker every now and then, teeny metallic, like, there. It was not as very small.
So we were going to rejoin.
Well, and when the image, so I was putting my hands through it. It did not dissipate. It was just, and it was at the corner of the room, and there's like a window, and so it actually came a little bit toward the corner, but mostly. So yeah, it was sort of in between. And I mean, the fact that putting my arms through it didn't change, was powerful because it was there, and so. And every time I've described it, which is not that often, but it makes you between this like little electrical sparkle.
So you're in the hospital with your dad.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't really make this clear. So I was home, and he was still in hospice, and
so you're sitting at home.
So I was at home, and it was a bedroom, and I had been sleeping, and it was dark out, and I woke up, I sat up, and I just was right there,
Right. So what were you looking at? What is that?
Well, I was there for quite a while, and then I went downstairs. I think I read some New York Times and came back up, and it was gone. And so through hospice, they often have religious different individuals who are there to serve you. And so I called them up and we sat down, and I said, we were talking. I said, this is what happened to me. And he said, that's the ancestors coming to get your father. And he said, you were, able to see this. It was shared with you, or, whatever, because you have some sort of something about you was going to connect to that. Whether it was, I've got goosebumps right now, but whether it's,
So did that resonate with you?
Well, it was such a unique experience. And so this is interesting because then I was in Princeton. My brother was in Baltimore with my dad. He said, you know, you don't need to. So I called at like 9 o'clock, a little after 9 o'clock in the morning to just check in with my dad, you know. And the nurse answered and said, you know, your father died somewhere. I don't know if he said his last breath was, you know, like after 9, maybe he called a little later. But so, you know, something happened before that, you know. And when you look at someone who's dying and changing, you know, I mean, they get, the skin is the bones, you know, the form of the previous form is not as crisp, you know, as the body is,
right,
you know. And so, and also, it's funny, I'm thinking about this, but there's almost a kind of, when I'm looking at my dad when he was ill and lying down, there's almost like a, not pleading, but something like that. There's a gesture in there. They're losing their faculties, you know, they're not as they're in this place, and their body even, you know, if you think of sculpture, I mean, it's kind of, you feel that moment of almost sculpture of a stillness, but it's a little bit, they become a little more abstract almost in their,
it's like they're there, but they're leaving.
Well, just their body is already sort of,
right.
There's almost, you know, there's a sense of the helplessness that I'm sure is, you know, in the ether. So I don't know, it's interesting. I was just sort of picturing my dad, and but yeah, I feel like he became less, it's function isn't even really the word, but it's just, you know, you really have, there's a change, you know, there's a definite change, you know, the form changes.
So all of this is relevant to me because we tend to see people as the other. And what I really want to do is break down that sense of the other. Oh,
that's the Jewish experience, being the other, exactly, which was a source of
scorn,
of anti-Semitism, you know, right. of you know, that segregation, the other, being different, right. You know, not joining the club,
right?
You know,
when you've been the other for generations, you no longer try to fit in.
Well, that's so interesting because the Jewish experience is full of assimilation,
right? An attempt to fit in.
Attempt to fit in, and I have this. I really like good films, and so there's this one film that it's just so elegant. In that you start out with a very elegant man who's they live in Paris, and his wife, they're very cultured, very, you know, in the social elite. I mean, she's an opera singer or something, and you know, this utter elegance. And so, you know, the Nazis come in, and she's not Jewish, but he gets taken away, and you know, a whole group of the people who've escaped, you know, the Nazis come in and they, like, you know, shoot down the whole line of people, you know, as they're hidden in the woods. And so this man got injured, but he was found and he ended up in a farmhouse, right? And so, but what was interesting when you talk about, you know, assimilation, is that, and this was true of German Jews, you know, high society, civilized society, that you watch this gentleman, his Jewishness come out, you know, his hair, you know, and he had a beard, and he looked like a Jew. He wasn't this elegant Parisian, you know. So it's kind of like, I think that no matter what you do, you know, you're always a Jew, right?
Mhm.
And but that was such a visual of it, you know. Um, and and I say sometimes, because I have some friends who Spanish background, and you know, if you scratch the skin of some people who are Spanish, there's a Jew underneath, you know, Jewish, because of the, you know, that whole you know, the Inquisition, you know,
Sure.
a lot of people, you know.
Sure. Sure.
But there is a lot of as you said, you know, the diaspora and things like that. And it's in the experience of slaves who
Sure.
went all over the place, you know,
Right.
were, which was something that this country and Americans have yet to beginning to discuss, at least
So-
not in our town, Princeton. But
So the big work, and I started using this word more and more, it's healing,
Mhm.
right? So there's a trauma that, you know, I think humanity has been through a lot of trauma.
Mhm.
But I think the most recent trauma that most of us can relate to is the 1500s, when we started, the word just left me, conquering
Mhm.
and
Colonialism.
colonialism. When colonialism, the big colonialism of the 1500s
Mhm.
and everything that followed that, that's what we're still dealing with now.
Oh yeah, I mean, this sounds, you know, this is like typical my way of dealing with things that I don't agree with. I so angry at the English, what they did with the colonialism. In
But it wasn't just the English.
I know,
either.
but I didn't want to go to England. I still haven't, but now I'd like to go. But there's an anger for, like, how could you?
Right.
You know.
Now you're very well educated, and one of the reasons why I like talking to you is because I like how you bring in these different references that makes what I'm saying feel more relevant. Not relevant, but it's like you bring in things that just connect to what I'm saying so well. But I think most of us are still trying to heal from this trauma.
Mm-hmm.
But my concern is that, you know, we're not as sympathetic as we could be to the other group.
Oh, we're so impoverished. I mean, there is. I did mention Princeton, not in our town, because you know, it's an organization, and we meet, and it brings people together, and it is, you know, about racism. You know, racism is so deep, and it's so ever present. And in fact, someone through Not in Our Town, Princeton, they showed a documentary,
Mm-hmm.
and it was called The Long Shadow.
Mm.
And that's as much of the titles I remember. It could have more to it, but
yeah,
it was, you know, the image and the words are powerful. And this is a woman who was from the South, and she was really kind of like repenting. You know, she was so, you know, I mean, racism really affects everyone.
yes,
You know, I mean, obviously. You know,
right. I mean, there's so much to it, you know, obviously, because I'm, you know, from the African diaspora. People think I'm speaking like for Black people, and it's not that I'm not, but, you know, the Latinos are dealing with it. You know, the natives who were here are dealing with it. And when the colonialism started, the people in the home country were already being mistreated.
Yes, it's true. Before the intervention of European introduction to countries that were colonized, there were rifts. There were, you know, different groups.
Right.
And well, and what I've learned about, for example, Sri Lanka, which has the Tiger group, sort of military group. It's kind of came out of its response to what happened when the colonial intervention. It's a disruption to what's going on in the country. That disruption of the existing social, political, economic culture that place, and it interrupts history and time.
Mm-hmm.
So there would be a different progression in said interactions in a country if it hadn't been taken over with colonial people.
So I think a part of what I'm saying is that, in places like Germany, France, and all of Europe, they had feudal systems that most of the peasants were unhappy with.
Yeah.
So the upper class, they had kind of juiced or milked as much as they could have out of their local country.
Yeah.
And they were now saying, hey, we can get some more from these other places.
Mm-hmm.
So this kind of mindset of, using people as a resource, it's like the Matrix, using them as a battery kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
This was going on locally before they started going out and doing it to other places. So now my concern is that we've had, 500 years of that, and obviously everything before that, but the last 500 years of that, we're trying to heal from that. But at the same time, we have a lot of people who aren't acknowledging what happened. Mm-hmm. And they're still not acknowledging what's happening today and how that's the remnant of what happened before. So we're sitting on top of all of these things, and we have people like you who are very passionate about healing and doing the good work, and we still are not having this conversation. Or when people like you and me start talking about healing and righting the ills of the world, it's almost like I don't want to hear that.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the people who I know who are doing well in life, they're ignoring most of these problems. They're ignoring the healing that needs to be done. Not saying that they don't care, but they're focused on advancing their status.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a division between people who are advancing their status, the people who are still struggling with the damage that's been done,
mm-hmm.
and a leadership who's just kind of like, well, how can we get more? So these things is kind of very pervasive, and I still feel weird when I talk about it. It's almost like, oh, you talking about that?
Yes, I think when you talk about racism, someone you say that's the deepest thing. Oh, that's what you're talking about. It's not even on their radar screen. Or worse, I met a young person recently who was in his 20s. But maybe in the 20s. And just, I don't know, was in such a sheltered environment, private school probably around here in Princeton. And I mean, I just was not, I couldn't even, it really couldn't have a conversation because he was just like blaming people. Like if you haven't done something or whatever, it's just because you don't want to take a risk. So I'm like, well, first you're just trying to get, you mustn't understand what happens when, you've been enslaved and you have no network. You've got, you don't have the support network of your family, the white kid who's, upper middle class and has everything given to him and is talking about risk, to make it. And I mean, that's something that is incomprehensible to me, to be so judgmental and discount that this is still an issue, racism or anything else.
Well, I think that's the whole critical race theory thing. It's that the way that history is taught you can almost skip over the traumas and the atrocities and the things that are keeping people down to this day. So people are walking around saying things like that because the history they were taught was not in the context of understanding, emotional intelligence and why these things in the world are the way they are today. So they know history, they can quote whatever. They've read all these books,
Well,
but they're missing it.
No, I don't think that this person, this type of person, whoever would fall under, speak about things like he does. It was so, it came from this, like if came from a total just disassociation from anything in the world or society.
Right.
I mean, you couldn't talk to him because he didn't know anything.
Right.
It was just, like sort of some Wall Street kind of like, well, if you want to, succeed, you got to take risks. It's like, meanwhile, he's working in his mother's business.
Right.
Like, have you taken any risks?
Right.
So.
Right. So these kind of ideas, they appear in many levels for, but like I said, well, I don't want to overgeneralize, but generally I would say well-to-do people are just focusing on themselves and doing well.
Yeah.
And they don't really understand what it's like for the people who didn't get those opportunities. Oh. And even if they do know, they kind of have these mantras that are like, oh, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and come on, don't make excuses. And, I don't even want to bash them,
Yeah, I mean, I have this problem with people who call themselves like Democrats when they still are out of touch with like reality. Talk about the other. They don't, I mean, like I've gotten to know a lot of people in Trenton just from, different things, even working on the census, and I spend a lot of time in Trenton where I'd like to spend time. And, so if people don't enter another world and then they, it's the nature of prejudice, prejudgment, you don't know. And it's the other, right?
Right.
And there's a lack of even, people don't even think of it as a world, and what actually I had, so I'm always interested in other people's worlds, and so I developed a friend who worked in CBS, and we had a lot of things in common. And except he actually had been homeless for a little while. Wow. He is doing really well. He's a great job, and he's really into a sport, a kind of karate sports, and he has community, and he, his family's important, and he's involved in his church. He's and
you learned from him.
Well, I learned, yes, we were talking, I had, he came over to our house and we had breakfast and brunch together, and my husband, and but we would talk, he and I would be talking, in different times and learning about each other's family and past, and where did you live, and where, when did you live here, and what it made painfully clear for me is that there are these two worlds that neither of us is a part of. Like, I want to be a part of your world, but the people in my world, the white world, the world of, whether it's the white kind of ethnicity, I don't think people realize that there's a world that they're not part of. Right. And it's a really cool, it's a really interesting world. It's really dynamic. There's just every level of what you would think of as art, music, right. Just being a human being, having right. Like just the, how you live, what your neighborhood's like, what, there's this whole world that it's almost like this awareness of when I had a history professor, Italian Renaissance history, and he took the map of the Mediterranean and he turned it upside down so that the African continent was on top, and the European, Italy, and so like suddenly these relationships in history became so much clearer in terms of interaction and trade, and so it changed. It changes the way you understand history just visually when you see that.
Let me just make sure we're on the same page, right? When you're talking about two worlds, right? We're talking about one world of privilege and another world of not having access.
Well, like that's, like one description. I'm talking about a world where I talk about flipping that because I see our two worlds. There's the white world and the non-white world.
Right.
It's not even non-white, it's the black world because of racism.
Right.
That's what it is.
Right.
And
black and white.
Black and white. And the white is here, right? So the idea of that map, right? Turning the map upside down. Well, for me, and talking to my friend and getting to know him, and all of a sudden, here's the black world, here's the white world. And I am like so angry that I'm only in the white world. Like I want to be in this world.
Right.
And that most of the white world, doesn't even think that there's a world.
Right.
It's just,
right.
Right. And so there's it's like you're sort of trying to knock on that world.
Right. But when you categorize it as black and white, I said privilege and lack of access. Is that consistent or no?
It's mostly, yeah, of course. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's a painful thing to be the one of privilege.
Right.
And so
now, Wendy.
But what I want to say though, when we qualify these two different worlds, despite the fact that there's less affluence and less opportunity and just less, that world is so rich. It's so rich. And I think that's what people don't understand. Like we're missing out so much. It's not just saying,
I want us to take a break and we're going to come right back with that, because as you're talking, I'm picturing Harlem and how, in the 40s and the 30s, 40s, how whites would go up to Harlem.
Yeah.
And obviously, Harlem was poor, it was dangerous, it was the ghetto, but the whites wanted to go there because, like you said, there was a richness.
Well, I have to reply to this before we take a break, because I don't think there has to be this visible richness. I'm talking about, like, we talk about the other, but one of the things that's most painful to me is that there's invisibility. And so that, to me, is the dividing line.
Say more about that.
And this is sort of socially and politically. And so this actually is not about color. I mean, it is and it isn't. It's about color, but it's compounded. For the Black experience, it's just compounded. It's the obvious invisibility. I mean, it is the invisibility. But then, like if there's two different definitions to a word, that's the one. That's the most significant one for invisibility. The second is that it's something that we all share and that we could empower ourselves with and improve our lives. Is that, I'm invisible too to our town government,
right? To
state government, and so and we as people have to take that back, because we can't keep being invisible. Because look at the world we're part of.
So you're talking about valuing each individual.
Yes.
and understanding that regardless of your social economic status, your education status, your cultural whatever, you have value, and
Well,
giving
absolutely.
value to everyone. And if your worldview gives preferential value to one group versus another, then you're missing out
Oh, totally.
on the total human experience where we can be learning and experiencing each other.
Well, yeah, but for the whites, that doesn't even if someone's like cares about like, you know, injustice and stuff, but it has to be skin deep. It has to be like real. It has to be my day is going to be where I get to, you know, spend time and like enjoy this. You know, it has to be like on the ground. You know.
All right, let's take that break. Thank you so much.